Here, read this.
Woof.
Passing portals o'er a nether, wi' injuries of time and weather. Passing portals o'er a nether, wi' injuries of time and weather. Passing portals o'er a nether, wi' injuries of time and weather. Bleak and scroofin, blent by blether, this fizz in graph has wi' hamely cap and feather been lifted off. I've got about an hour or so before I need to get the bus to Glasgow for this launch. I'm just trying to practice my Scots accent. I have asked Amy and Rona, who are the editors of the collection and are running the event, what they'd think about someone who sounds like this in their normal voice doing a Scots accent. I've realised there are quite a lot of distinguished Scots writers there, so I'm a little bit, I know how it looks, and I don't want to just seem like an Englishman in Scots cosplay, like one of the tourists who rents a kilt for his stag do or something. So I'm just sort of practicing my accent. If you watch the podcast, I do a Scots voice a lot when I do an episode on Burns or Fergusson. The thing with accents is you need a kind of anchor word that's going to get you into it. I think that's why so many, when people say do a celebrity or do a Scottish or do a different nationality, that the first thing they say usually is the celebrity's name. Oh, I'm Sean Connery, because they associate the name with the accent, and the name is somehow easier to do in the accent. And it's same with like doing a Scots accent. You want that word that's gonna sort of bring the whole accent to you. And obviously this poem is in Scots, so it's full of uniquely Scots word. Bleak and scroofin, that's a good one. I should have opened the poem with that, then this would be a doddle. Instead, I opened it with the word passing portals, which I can't not hear the way I would say that in my very sort of plummy English way. Passing portals. It's quite, I don't know why I'm struggling to find this to Scotify that. So if nothing else, this video will serve as a lesson for the next time I do a Scots poem that I'm going to read out. Start with a really, really Scots word. Seiriki, fua grown and gruen, spent the centuries renewing. Her rotted, I can hear my English vowels coming out. It's horrible. Got to try and get rid of them, but also got to try and get rid of noticing them, because otherwise, when I try and read this whole thing out, it's just going to congeal somewhere around Yorkshire and stay there. Passing portals o'er a nether, wi' injuries of time and weather. Bleak and scroofin, blent by blether, this fizzing graph has wi' hamely cap and feather been lifted off. Seiriki, fua grown and gruen, fua grown and gruen, spent the centuries renewing. Her rotted smile raised a buin wi' bridge and file. Greeting reed, Now bambasement at Bamboogle, someone gaze a shelf a shugle, dusting down ma shifty oogle upon the whirl. Watchful why the cronies crudel, simply snarl. Another unexpected issue with this is that I tried to look at rhyme words that Fergusson actually used, because he's quite playful with rhymes, and he also wrote for the Scottish accent but not consistently with Scots spelling. So there'll be English looking words that only sort of fit his rhyme scheme once you read them with a Scottish accent. And one of them, I'm sure, was the word world and the word snarl. And world in Scots is warl, W-A-R-L apostrophe, and then snarl is snarl, the way that it would be spelled in English. But what I found is in delivery, I can say warl perfectly fine, but snarl is actually quite difficult. So my line is dusting down my shifty oogle upon the warl. Watchful why the cronies crudel, I simply snarl. I think that's how I've got to do it. It suddenly drops back to English and it's very jarring. I simply snarl. It just suddenly sounds pallid and aristocratic. So yeah, snarl. Watchful why the cronies crudel, I simply snarl. Slow down, that's the key. So I've got to slow down on that bit. I know it would probably be wise to like listen to a lot of proper Scots speakers, but I find that I tune in so sort of obsessively on an individual's accent. Not that I've got any skill for it, but just that I'll start thinking about that person's voice so much that it will completely just cancel my belief that I can actually do it. So I'm sort of fudging it by just practicing over and over again. Just to give you a little bit of info about my poem, because I also need to practice talking about it. It's written as if from the perspective of a recently discovered supposed portrait of Fergusson, who has there's a very murky past and history of his portraiture, missing paintings, disputed likenesses, etc. I actually made a video about this. If you want to go and have a look, I'll link it down below. Anyway, last year, about this time last year, I went to a meeting at the Irving Burns Club where Professor Gerard Carruthers unveiled this new portrait that he'd found, and he's convinced it is Fergusson, and he gave a history of the portraits, which is what I was basing my video on. I thought it would be quite fitting as an Englishman writing in Scots to be writing from the perspective of a disputed portrait. Even if it is of Fergusson, it could be a likeness of a likeness of a likeness. Hopefully that will come across to the authentic Scots poets in the audience today. So yeah, my poem, which is called Fergusson's Fizz, is in happy stanzas, it's in Scots, and it tells the treacherous voyage Fergusson's likeness has made, the idea of his likeness, as narrated by one of his possible portraits. It's not quite as high concept as I've made it sound, but that's the simplest way to describe it. It's a poem about pictures. Passing portals o'er and nether, wi' injuries of time and weather, blakent scroofing blent by blether, this fizzing graph has, wi' hamely cap and feather, been lifted off. Sae Reekie, fu a groan and gruen, spent the centuries renewing, her rotted smile raised a buin wi' bridge and file, mixing marks a younger ruin with ripest style. Robert, as his smedum revelled, left a visage to be vesseled, greeting readers with gledge levelled to guard his tomes, but the likeness cam dishevelled as bodies bones. Instead were copies coppered quick, 6 siblings softening free the wick, or drawn with pluffy peepers strick without remeed. What ranger Roberts rivered thick through one sma' heed. But now bambeasement at bamboogle, someone gies a shelf a shugle dusting down ma shifty oogle upon the whirl. Watchful why the cronies cruddle, a simply snarl. But better freed frae cosy hive, however copper plate connive, whatever unca pen might strive with goodling grace, for what could seem sae more alive than a changing face? Well, it's now a couple of weeks on from that launch in Glasgow, and it went really well. I think my reading went okay. I was in and amongst people with authentic Scots accents, but I was also amongst fellow English people sort of sheepishly saying they were going to be doing a Scots accent. So I wasn't alone, and that helped a great deal. Now, I was going to film something like this afterwards at the launch, but unfortunately the book hadn't quite arrived. But it has now in the post, so I've got my beautiful copy of O'er All My Labours, Say Your Skill, which is a quote from Fergusson's Ode to a Bee. It's really beautifully put together by Taproot Press, and the cover illustration is by Andrew Redmond Barr. Andrew was also at the launch, and he talked a little bit about his ideas for the illustration. It was interesting to hear him talk about how he was going to incorporate real and surviving Edinburgh landmarks like the Tron, which you can see there in front of Arthur's Seat and Salisbury Crags. But also because so much of the Edinburgh of Ferguson's day, the Edinburgh that he wrote about, the house he was born in on Cap and Feather Close, has been lost or rebuilt over or destroyed. That also gave him liberties to invent. And so the buildings in the foreground are kind of Andrew's reconstruction of what Ferguson's neighbourhood might have looked like. And sticking with illustrators before we start talking about poetry, The collection opens with a caricature of Fergusson by Gerald Mangan. I thought it was really cool to have a caricature in there, since quite a lot of the poems, including my own, are talking about images of Fergusson. If you've seen my previous videos on Fergusson, you'll know there's a checkered past of portraits of Fergusson, and that's very much what my poem is about, a sort of spurious portrait of him that may or may not be the real Fergusson, and what does it mean to have possibly fictional, possibly dubious likenesses of someone floating around in the public consciousness. But several of the other poems in the collection also picked on certain portraits. A lot of them picked on the statue that David Annand made that's on the Canongate, which I've also talked about in a previous video. So it was really cool to see the different ways some of us had gone down the same track, and sometimes similar themes circulated, and sometimes they were, we were completely poles apart. There's one poem in here that's co-authored by Rog Glass and Elle Nash, which is about a different portrait of Fergusson, which has a wonderful line in it about his eyes being full of asylum. So the book is organised to reflect different sections of Fergusson's life. There's a section on madness and death. There's a section on portraits and fame and so on. And there's a real range of languages. I mean, I think this is one of the signal strengths of this collection. There's poems in English, poems in Scots, and poems in Gaelic as well. This book has a Gaelic editor who provided translations, sometimes into English, sometimes into Scots, and there's at least one poem that is simply left in the Gaelic. I was particularly interested by that because for the last year or so I've been trying to teach myself Gaelic, and my Gaelic is nowhere near good enough to be able to translate these poems on my own. But it is just fascinating to start to recognise little bits and pieces of certain words, and then be able to read the translations of new poems being written in Gaelic. I just loved that. And perhaps as a result of the numerous different languages, there's quite a few poems that return to the idea of language, a sort of contest between English and Scots. There's a really good riff on the Gaists, which has pretty much the language of English and the language of Scots going at each other. In dialogue. There's also a poem I really liked called The Gaudspink, after a title of a Fergusson poem, which is actually going to be the next podcast with the editors as my guests, as Amy Wilcoxon and Rona Brown. But the Gaudspink of this collection is by a poet called Nuala Watt, and she compares Scots words and songbirds, and says that when she typed the Scots word for goldfinch, Gaudspink, her phone thought she meant to write Godspeed. Really lovely, clever poem riffing on Fergusson's Gaudspink. Nearly said goldfinch. Rona Brown makes the point that Fergusson strikes her as a poet's poet. He seems to excite poets in a particular way. And I think that's reflected in the collection, not only by the poets trying to live up to the title. So, all my labours say your skill, sort of test your skill. It's a bit of a challenge of a title to poets who I think delighted in rising to it. But also there's a real, it's funny to note, there's a real note of fraternity and chumminess in the poems where poets, by some abstraction, sort of are in dialogue with Fergusson. I think the feeling you come away with after reading the collection is that these are poems in tribute to an absent friend, not someone who's been dead for centuries. So obviously I strongly recommend this book, and it's not just because I'm in it. I'll leave links to Taproot Press so you can order a copy if you wish, and just want to say once again thank you to Amy Wilcoxon and Rona Brown for putting this together, Andrew Redmond Barr for providing his illustration, and Patrick and the team at Taproot Press for making such a lovely book. That's all for now though. Thank you for watching, and until next time, happy reading.